Welcome to the Unraveling the Scriptures channel. In the 6th century BC, a dark mystery shrouded the fate of three giants of the ancient world. Jerusalem, the holy city revered as the spiritual heart of the earth, was reduced to ashes. Babylon, ruler of the greatest empire ever known, vanished in a single night, swallowed by history. Nineveh, a metropolis of 600,000 souls, a megacity at a time when London was nothing more than a village, was annihilated so completely that its location remained hidden for 2,500 years. These were not fragile or insignificant cities. They were bastions of power, culture, and faith. What could have caused such absolute and sudden destruction, capable of erasing these titans of the past? A riddle whispers through the centuries, daring us to uncover its causes. Corinth, the city of moral decay. Situated on the narrow isthmus that links mainland Greece to the Peloponnese, Corinth thrived as a bustling hub of trade and vice, its strategic location controlling maritime traffic between the Ionian and Aegean seas. The city's two ports, Lyceum and Centrae, welcomed sailors, merchants, and travelers from across the Mediterranean, creating a cosmopolitan melting pot where cultures clashed and immorality flourished. Corinth's wealth was built not only on commerce, but also on its reputation as a center of hedonistic indulgence where sin itself was turned into a commodity. Towering over the city skyline, the mighty Corinth was crowned by the Temple of Aphrodite, a monument to the goddess of love and sensuality. Within its walls, more than 1,000 sacred prostitutes, known as hierodouloi, performed ritual acts of sexual worship, blending carnality with religious devotion. These prolonged orgiastic rites, sometimes lasting for days, were not merely tolerated, but celebrated as sacred acts, drawing devotees from distant lands. The city's moral decay was so widespread that the expression "to live like a Corinthian" became synonymous with debauchery throughout the Roman Empire. When the Apostle Paul arrived in Corinth around AD 50, he found a church struggling to break free from the moral swamp of the city. In 1 Corinthians 5:1, he expressed astonishment at a scandalous case of a man openly living with his stepmother, a practice the local church, shockingly, considered trivial. Corinth's streets teemed with vice, and its ports served as gateways for sailors seeking the city's infamous pleasures. Paul's two letters to the Corinthians reveal his tireless efforts to purify the fledgling Christian community, warning against participation in rituals he equated with communion with demons, 1 Corinthians 10:20-21. Yet Corinth was only one example of the spiritual corruption of the ancient world. Athens, the throne of proud philosophy. Athens, hailed as the cradle of philosophy and democracy, stood as the intellectual jewel of the ancient world. Its plazas and marble columns echoed with the debates of masters such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who shaped Western thought. On the Areopagus, the relentless pursuit of knowledge was celebrated as the pinnacle of human reason. But behind this facade of wisdom lay a deep spiritual void. In Acts 17:23, Paul, while walking through the city, found an altar inscribed, "To the unknown God." The implicit confession was clear: all of Athens' philosophy, however grand, had failed to reach the true God. While Athenians endlessly debated new ideas, Acts 17:21, they also multiplied altars to pagan deities, adorning the city with hundreds of statues that bore witness to their idolatry. The Parthenon, dedicated to Athena, symbolized this spiritual arrogance, where human knowledge sought to rival divine revelation. Paul boldly challenged this mindset, preaching about the resurrection, but was mocked by Epicurean and Stoic philosophers who considered the message of the cross foolishness, 1 Corinthians 1:23. Athens thus became the embodiment of intellectual pride, exalting human logic while refusing to bow before eternal wisdom. Ephesus, the capital of occult practices. Ephesus, a glittering metropolis of Asia Minor, was renowned as the epicenter of mystical and occult practices in the ancient world, a kind of spiritual Las Vegas. At the heart of the city stood the Temple of Artemis, Diana, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a colossal structure adorned with intricate sculptures and towering columns. Far from being merely an architectural marvel, the temple was a hub of dark rituals where priestesses performed ceremonies involving human blood and merchants sold cursed amulets that promised wealth, power, or protection. The streets of Ephesus teemed with sorcerers, fortune-tellers, and necromancers, all competing for clients in a city obsessed with supernatural power. Magical texts, known as the Ephesia Grammata, were highly prized, with spells and incantations sold at exorbitant prices. Acts 19:19 records a remarkable event in which newly converted Christians publicly burned these occultist books, valued at 50,000 silver drachmas, the equivalent of about 137 years of a laborer's wages. This act symbolized a profound spiritual awakening in a city immersed in darkness. Paul's ministry in Ephesus, which lasted over 2 years, Acts 19:10, triggered a dramatic confrontation with the entrenched spiritual powers of the city. The mass conversion of the Ephesians and the destruction of their magical texts threatened the business of local craftsmen, particularly those who manufactured silver shrines dedicated to Artemis. Demetrius, a silversmith, incited a riot, leading a frenzied crowd to shout for 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," Acts 19:34. The uproar revealed the city's deep addiction to its occult practices, where even new believers struggled to abandon their enchanted artifacts. Yet the spiritual battle in Ephesus paled in comparison to the betrayal of a city once chosen by God. Jerusalem, the holy city turned apostate. Jerusalem, the holiest city in biblical history, had been established as the dwelling place of God's presence, where Solomon's temple shone with gold and housed the Ark of the Covenant. Destined to be a beacon of divine light to the nations, it became, over time, a symbol of spiritual betrayal. In Ezekiel 16:15, God himself accuses Jerusalem of prostituting her beauty, giving herself to idolatry and immorality with passers-by. Shockingly, within the sacred temple precincts, priests introduced cult prostitutes, turning God's house into a stage for pagan orgies. The desecration deepened as idolatry penetrated the innermost sanctuaries of the temple. Jeremiah 7:30 laments that the people of Judah set up abominable idols inside the very temple, defiling the place that bore God's name. Statues of foreign gods stood in blasphemous proximity to the Ark of the Covenant, a direct affront to Israel's covenant with God. The reign of King Manasseh marked the darkest chapter in Jerusalem's history, as recorded in 2 Kings 21:6. He not only practiced divination and witchcraft, but committed the unthinkable act of sacrificing his own son in a fire ritual to pagan gods, desecrating the city of David. The women of Jerusalem wept for Tammuz, a Mesopotamian deity, in the courts of the temple, while the men turned their backs on God's altar to worship the sun, Ezekiel 8:14-16. This mass rebellion culminated in divine withdrawal, when Ezekiel 10:18 describes the glory of the Lord departing from the temple, leaving the once holy city abandoned. Rome, the empire of blood and pleasure. Rome, the capital of the greatest empire of antiquity, flaunted its power with colossal monuments, mighty roads, and invincible legions. But behind the imperial eagles beat a heart surrendered to cruelty and pleasure. The Colosseum, stage of bloody spectacles, filled with crowds who delighted in watching gladiators tear each other apart, and Christians devoured by wild beasts. The city that ruled the world was unashamed to satisfy its thirst for blood, turning violence into a national pastime. Rome was also marked by moral depravity. Its emperors competed in scandals. Nero burned the city and blamed the Christians, turning them into human torches. Caligula turned the palace into a brothel, and Domitian demanded to be called Lord and God. This arrogance echoes in Revelation 17, where Rome is depicted as the great harlot, drunk with the blood of the saints. Its wealth was sustained by slavery, crushing taxes, and imperial cults that demanded worship of Caesar. In Romans 1, Paul describes the moral collapse Rome embodied, men and women given over to shameful passions, drowning in idolatry and pride. The empire that believed itself eternal was, in truth, corroded from within, collapsing under the weight of its own depravity. Alexandria, the city of corrupted wisdom. Founded by Alexander the Great, Alexandria flourished as a beacon of knowledge in the Mediterranean. Its legendary library, considered the largest in the ancient world, housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, gathering the wisdom of diverse nations and cultures. Philosophers, mathematicians, and astronomers gathered in its halls, proclaiming themselves guardians of truth. Yet this pursuit of knowledge did not lead to divine light, but to the arrogance of human intellect. Paul warned in Colossians 2:8, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men and not according to Christ." Alexandria also became the cradle of Gnosticism, a doctrine that blended Christian elements with pagan philosophies, corrupting the faith and leading many astray from the truth. Its trust in human intellect turned into a fortress of pride, where reason attempted to usurp revelation. Even the Jews of the city, authors of the Septuagint translation, were swallowed up by Hellenistic influence, divided by intellectual and religious disputes. The city that should have illuminated the world with knowledge became instead a symbol of intellectual vanity, where man exalted his own mind above the Creator. Samaria, the capital of division and idolatry. Samaria, established as a rival capital to Jerusalem, was born of political ambition but became the epicenter of spiritual division. King Omri, seeking to consolidate power in the northern kingdom of Israel, bought a hill for 2 talents of silver and built a fortified city, 1 Kings 16:24. This strategic move, however, gave rise to a counterfeit religion that would lead 10 tribes of Israel into oblivion. As 1 Kings 16:25 declares, Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and acted more wickedly than all who were before him, surpassing even the atrocities of kings who practiced human sacrifice. His son Ahab deepened Samaria's corruption by marrying Jezebel, a Sidonian princess who introduced the worship of Baal and Asherah on an unprecedented scale. According to 1 Kings 16:31-33, she brought 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, turning Samaria into a fortress of 2 demonic cults. The city's most insidious sin was its perversion of Israel's faith. Jeroboam I had erected golden calves in Bethel and Dan, declaring, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." 1 Kings 12:28. This syncretistic religion blended elements of Yahweh worship with pagan practices, creating a convenient and popular substitute for worship in Jerusalem. The consequences were catastrophic. In 2 Kings 17:6, King Shalmaneser V of Assyria conquered Samaria in 722 BC, deporting the 10 northern tribes to Assyria, where they vanished from history, remembered as the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Samaria's false religion achieved what even Sodom had not: the eradication of entire tribes of God's covenant people. This tragic legacy stands as a solemn reminder of the dangers of mixing divine truth with falsehood. And yet, the darkness of another city would soon reveal a glimpse of redemption amid corruption. Philadelphia, the city of fragile faith. Philadelphia, founded in the 2nd century BC and known as the City of Brotherly Love, was strategically located in Asia Minor, serving as a cultural gateway between East and West. Yet its apparent devotion and hospitality were often shaken by both physical and spiritual fragility. Situated in a seismic region, Philadelphia suffered devastating earthquakes that forced its inhabitants to live in constant fear and instability. This material insecurity reflected in their faith as well, sometimes strong, sometimes wavering. In Revelation 3:8, Christ commends the small church of Philadelphia for having little strength, yet you have kept my word. Nevertheless, the city lived under the shadow of religious temptations and cultural pressures. The contrast was clear. While Jerusalem and Rome were corrupted by excessive power, Philadelphia faced the challenge of fragility and perseverance. Christ promised his faithful an open door that no one could shut, but the implicit warning was evident. Faithfulness could not be sustained by nominal devotion alone, but required steadfastness against the spiritual tremors that threatened to topple their faith. Jericho, the fortress of corruption. Jericho, one of the oldest cities in the world, rose as an impregnable fortress with double walls reaching 8 meters high. Yet behind these formidable defenses lay a culture steeped in moral and spiritual decay. Archaeological evidence suggests that Jericho was a center of cultic prostitution, with temples dedicated to pagan deities where sacred prostitutes, including women like Rahab, played central roles in ritual worship. This systemic corruption permeated the city, turning it into a place of exploitation and violence against travelers and foreigners. The story of Rahab, recorded in Joshua 2, reveals the depth of Jericho's condemnation. Rahab, a prostitute, sheltered the Israelite spies, confessing in Joshua 2:9-11 that she had heard of the mighty acts of the Lord, including the parting of the Red Sea, and believed Jericho was doomed. Her decision to help the spies was not merely pragmatic, but a profound act of faith in the God of Israel, born of her recognition of her city's moral bankruptcy. In Joshua 6:17, God spared Rahab and her family when Jericho's walls fell, honoring her mercy amidst a city that had lost all humanity. The destruction of Jericho was total, and Joshua 6:26 pronounced a curse on anyone who attempted to rebuild it, sealing its fate as a symbol of divine judgment. Unlike Samaria, which erased entire tribes, Jericho's fall allowed for a redemptive exception in Rahab, whose faith earned her a place in the lineage of Christ, Matthew 1:5. Laodicea, the city of spiritual indifference. Laodicea, one of the wealthiest cities of Phrygia, flaunted its prosperity with pride. Its commerce thrived through the textile industry and the eye salve produced in its medical schools, which attracted patients from across the region. Its inhabitants boasted of their independence, especially after rebuilding the city on their own, following a devastating earthquake in the 1st century AD. But this material self-sufficiency concealed a deep spiritual ruin. In Revelation 3:16-17, Christ condemned their lukewarm faith. "So, because you are lukewarm, and neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing, not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked." Laodicea became the symbol of a church that confused material prosperity with divine blessing. Its temples were adorned, its citizens proud of their wealth, yet their faith was apathetic and indifferent. The lukewarm water supply that flowed from Hierapolis into the city became a natural metaphor for their insipid spirituality, lacking both the refreshing vitality of cold water and the healing vigor of hot water. Laodicea represents the danger of a faith numbed by comfort, where abundance breeds spiritual blindness and Christ's voice is left knocking outside the door. Revelation 3:20. Tyre, the city that claimed divinity. Tyre, the commercial titan of the ancient world, rose as the New York of antiquity, with its maritime empire stretching across 3 continents. From Spain to India, Tyrian ships carried gold, silver, spices, and slaves, amassing seemingly limitless wealth. Colonies like Carthage and Gades expanded Tyre's influence, making it a global center of trade and power. But this prosperity fueled an arrogance that reached blasphemous heights. In Ezekiel 28:2, God condemned the king of Tyre, declaring, "Because your heart is proud, and you have said, 'I am a god,' I sit in the seat of gods in the heart of the seas." The king, dwelling in his palace on a fortified island, dared to claim divine status, equating his wealth and power with divinity itself. Tyre's religion was rooted in its own success, teaching that prosperity was proof of godhood. Temples to Melkart and Astarte, adorned with lavish treasures, became centers of worship not to deities, but to wealth itself. Even sacred prostitution, common in the ancient Near East, was turned into commercial enterprise, with temple courtesans serving profit more than piety. Isaiah 23:17 prophesies Tyre's fate, stating, "At the end of 70 years, the Lord will visit Tyre, and she will return to her wages and will prostitute herself with all the kingdoms of the world." Ezekiel 27:13 chillingly records its commerce in human lives. Javan, Tubal, and Meshech traded with you. They exchanged human beings and articles of bronze for your wares. This arrogance drew divine judgment. Ezekiel 26:21 declares, "I will make you a horror, and you shall be no more. Though you be sought for, you will never be found again." In 332 BC, the conquest of Alexander the Great reduced Tyre to ruins, as he connected its island fortress to the mainland with a causeway, leaving it a heap of stones in the sea. Yet another city would surpass even Tyre's arrogance, with a cruelty that shocked the ancient world: Nineveh, the capital of cruelty. Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, stood as a monument to brutality, its very name synonymous with terror and bloodshed. The Assyrians perfected psychological warfare, using calculated cruelty to subdue enemies before battle even began. Assyrian annals, discovered in royal libraries, boast of horrifying practices: prisoners impaled on stakes, children burned alive before their parents, and enemies flayed alive. Their skins hung on city walls as macabre trophies. Nahum 3:1 describes Nineveh as the bloody city, full of lies and plunder, with the Hebrew word for bloody literally meaning city of bloods, reflecting the systematic, industrial-scale violence that defined its culture. The gods of Nineveh, such as Ishtar and Ninurta, demanded constant human sacrifice, and temple prostitution was not a commercial enterprise, but a ritual to appease bloodthirsty deities. Nahum 3:4 reveals the city's spiritual corruption, because of the countless whorings of the prostitute, graceful and deadly, who betrays nations with her whorings and peoples with her sorceries. Nineveh exported its occult practices, sending priestesses to corrupt the religious systems of conquered lands, creating a global network of spiritual pollution. The prophet Jonah, preaching in Nineveh in the 8th century BC, brought about a temporary repentance, Jonah 3:5-10, but the city's reform was short-lived. By the 7th century BC, Nineveh's wickedness surpassed its former sins. Zephaniah 2:15 captures its final arrogance. "This is the exultant city that lived securely, that said in her heart, 'I am, and there is no one else.'" In 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes destroyed Nineveh in a single night, leaving it a desolate ruin. Yet another group of cities, often overshadowed, rivaled even Nineveh's depravity: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, the sister cities of depravity. Sodom is infamous, but her sister cities, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, formed a coalition of wickedness that shared the same fate. Deuteronomy 29:23 describes their collective destruction. "The whole land burned out with brimstone and salt. Nothing is sown and nothing grows, where no plant can sprout, a devastation like that of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim." These four cities, situated in the fertile plain of the Jordan, were bound by a shared culture of corruption, though the notoriety of Sodom often eclipses her companions, especially Zeboim, whose sins equaled or even surpassed hers. Ezekiel 16:48-49 delivers a shocking comparison. "As I live, declares the Lord God, your sister Sodom and her daughters have not done as you and your daughters have done. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." Astonishingly, God uses Sodom as a lesser example compared to Jerusalem, implying that Zeboim's crimes were even more heinous. While Sodom perverted hospitality, Zeboim specialized in public violence against strangers, elevating cruelty into a civic spectacle. Jewish tradition, recorded by historians like Josephus, recounts that Zeboim institutionalized brutality through law. Giving alms was punishable by death, judges extorted defendants, and travelers were robbed through fabricated tolls. The most grotesque reports describe pregnant women cut open for wages on the sex of their unborn children, a practice that epitomized the city's moral collapse. Isaiah 1:10 compares the leaders of Jerusalem to the rulers of Sodom and its people to the people of Gomorrah, underscoring how systemic corruption infected even neighboring nations. The destruction of Zeboim, like that of her sister cities, was catastrophic. Josephus notes that fire erupted from the very ground, not the sky as in Sodom, as though the city's very foundations were consumed by infernal judgment. And yet, the final city in this narrative would leave a legacy of corruption that influenced the entire world. Babylon, the mother of all abominations. Babylon was not merely a city, but a system, a civilization built on rebellion against God, whose influence stretched from the Tower of Babel to the empire of Nebuchadnezzar. Revelation 17:5 assigns it a chilling title, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. As the originator of spiritual corruption, Babylon taught other nations the ways of idolatry, immorality, and disobedience. Jeremiah 51:7 describes its global seduction. Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand, making all the earth drunk. The nations drank of her wine, therefore the nations went mad. The merchants of Babylon spread corruption along with their goods, infiltrating cultures with idolatrous religions and depraved practices. The opulent temples dedicated to Marduk and Ishtar were centers of ritual prostitution and human sacrifice, designed to glorify its power. Daniel himself witnessed Babylon's methods firsthand. Young captives from noble families, including himself, were forcibly assimilated, fed with food offered to idols, and trained to serve a system that despised his God. Daniel 1:3-7. Most terrifying was its persecution of the righteous. Revelation 17:6 reveals, "I saw the woman, drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus." The city thrived on the suffering of God's people, growing stronger with every act of violence. Isaiah 47:8-9 captures Babylon's arrogance. "Now then listen, you lover of pleasure, lounging in your security and saying to yourself, 'I am, and there is none besides me.'" Declaring itself the only reality, Babylon denied any higher power. Yet its fall was inevitable, as prophesied in Revelation 18:2. Fallen. Fallen is Babylon the Great. Conquered by the Persians in 539 BC, its legacy of rebellion endured, shaping every corrupt system that followed. Still, another city would one day surpass Babylon, terrifying even to the angels of God. Sodom, the pinnacle of perversion. Sodom, the epitome of human depravity, stands as an eternal symbol of rebellion against God's natural order. Genesis 19:4-5 records a scene almost beyond comprehension. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them." The entire male population of Sodom mobilized to commit a collective assault against two angelic visitors, an act not only of sexual immorality, but of outright war against heaven itself. Ezekiel 16:49 traces the roots of Sodom's downfall. "Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." The city's sin began with pride and ingratitude, hoarding wealth while ignoring the afflicted. Jude 7 adds a terrifying detail. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. The phrase unnatural desire suggests practices beyond mere human perversion, possibly involving demonic or spiritual entities, a rebellion that transcended earthly sin. God's response was swift and final. Genesis 19:24-25 declares, "Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities, and all the valley, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground." This was not a natural disaster, but a direct supernatural intervention, leaving only Lot and his daughters as survivors. The very name Sodom became synonymous with divine judgment and moral collapse, a warning etched into history about the fate of a society that declares war on its creator. From Jerusalem's betrayal to Babylon's arrogance, from Nineveh's cruelty to Rome's bloodlust, history whispers the same truth. No city, no empire, no culture built on pride, idolatry, and corruption can stand before the justice of God. Their ruins are not only relics of the past, but warnings carved into time itself, reminders that power without righteousness leads to destruction. Yet amid judgment, God always preserves a remnant, a spark of faith, a Rahab, a Philadelphia, a voice that hardens. The rise and fall of these cities tell us one story: human glory fades, but the kingdom of God remains forever. See you soon.